A police clash at the border as thousands of Honduran migrants search for refuge. The message from the White House that could be making things worse.
I've got the expertise to hit the ground sprinting.
I think that it's time to have somebody in county government that's looking out for working families. Too many of us are getting priced out of San Diego.
For the first time in more than 20 years, an open supervisor seat for one San Diego County district. We'll hear from two candidates who want the job.
They really want to take care of their schools and the education for our kids, and we're at the mercy of the information being provided to us.
Still waiting for a refund after the promise of an after-school program in San Ysidro fell through. KPBS Evening Edition starts right now. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Susan Murphy. Mexico says it will ask the United Nations Refugee Office for help with the arrival of several thousand Honduran migrants. President Trump took to Twitter again today, demanding Mexico to stop Hondurans who are trying to reach the U.S. Human rights activists say Trump's demand is endangering lives. KPBS border reporter Jean Guerrero has the story.
Hundreds of Hondurans have started arriving at Mexico's southern border, fleeing violence and poverty, just as Mexico deployed dozens of federal police to a bridge where they plan to cross. Irineo Mujica, a migrant activist with Pueblos Sin Fronteras, says that to get around the police, some people are hopping on flimsy rafts to cross a dangerous river.
And there's a lot of women and children. There's hundreds of women and children. So we are worried that some of them might drown or something like that, and we are urging the Mexican government not to use the violence because these people have international rights to seek asylum.
Mujica says he and about 150 volunteers are standing by to save people. He says he blames U.S. and Mexican authorities for any deaths that may occur. The White House didn't respond to a request for comment. Hours after KPBS spoke to Mujica, a Facebook Live video showed him being shoved into a white van by Mexican federal police and immigration officials. Every year since 2014, Mexico has received funding from the U.S. to increase border security along its border with Guatemala, including money to buy weapons. Human rights activists say this breaks asylum laws and puts people's lives at risk, given Mexico's own problems of violence and impunity. Earlier this month, I sat down with Mexico's ambassador to the U.S., Jerónimo Gutiérrez, to discuss those concerns. Currently, Mexico helps the United States by detaining and deporting tens of thousands of Central Americans who are caught crossing the border illegally. With Plan Frontera Sur.
What I want to emphasize is what we do on migration policy, we do it because it's in A, our best interest, or B, it is established in our own laws. So yes, there is an important number of nationals from Central America enter irregularly Mexico.
What about the argument that these are people who are fleeing violence, human rights attorneys who say that Mexico is actually breaking international refugee law on behalf of the United States by deporting these people back to Central America? What does Mexico say about that?
Well, I would respectfully say that they're wrong, and I think that I would invite them to have a conversation with us about what is actually going on. If Mexico decides that it's going to deport or repatriate Central American nationals because they enter our country with the appropriate documentation, that in a sense does not have to do anything with the United States. Certainly, we must do that in a humane way, with absolute respect of human rights, in accordance with international law, and that's what we do. But every country has the right to enforce its own immigration laws.
What about the fact that some of these people are fleeing violence, heading to the United States, and the same criminal organizations that have power in Central America extend through Mexico? Precisely because organized crime is international nowadays. We must work with countries like the United States and Central America, as the United States must work with us and Central America, and vice versa.
And I think that, rightly so, but these NGOs or the centers, I think that they would agree that it's also very risky for people to fall into the hands of human smugglers and traffickers. And the sort of cooperation that we're having is very much centered on that.
And can you just, before we finish, answer me, will Mexico require asylum seekers from Central America to apply for asylum in Mexico rather than in the United States? Is that a possibility, or is that something that you're leaving to the next administration?
What we're looking at right now is simply the fact that Mexico itself has recently encountered a significant increase in requests for, in our case, refuge, which is translated in asylum in the United States. The numbers have grown exponentially in the past 3 to 4 or 5 years. And what we want to do is establish best practices from a regional perspective. That first, we need to improve our capacity to address that phenomenon in Mexico, irrespective of the United States. And at the same time, I believe that we want to work with the United States to make sure that asylum systems anywhere are not abused.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My pleasure. Thank you.
That was KPBS border reporter Jean Guerrero with Mexico's ambassador to the U.S., Geronimo Gutierrez. Our coverage continues on air and online at kpbs.org. A federal judge in San Diego today ordered the Trump administration to immediately move forward with asylum determinations for migrant families separated at the border. That's despite objection from the government that a proposed settlement agreement hasn't been finalized. Last month, U.S. District Judge Dana Sabra gave preliminary approval on reunited migrant families who would get a second chance at applying for asylum. Both sides agreed that the asylum process should start as soon as possible. The District 5 seat on the County Board of Supervisors is up for grabs for the first time in more than 2 decades. KPBS reporter Priya Sridhar talked with the candidates running to replace him.
Jim Desmond says his 12 years of experience as mayor of San Marcos make him a good fit for the Board of Supervisors.
I've got the expertise to hit the ground sprinting. The relationships that I've got countywide, the experience I've got countywide, and serving on many different commissions, I think gives me the advantage in this race.
Do you have any questions or any concerns in the community?
His opponent, Michelle Gomez, is a lifelong resident of Southern California, but never been elected to an office. She gave up her job as a legislative analyst this summer after finishing second in the primaries behind Desmond.
I think that it's time to have somebody in county government that's looking out for working families. Too many of us are getting priced out of San Diego, and it's critically important that we have someone that represents our values.
The two agree the top issues in North County will continue to be the lack of affordable housing and traffic congestion, but they have opposing views on tackling that congestion. Desmond believes adding more managed and HOV lanes, utilizing autonomous vehicles, and fixing the roads is the solution. Gomez thinks people want more access to mass transit.
We have a whole group of young people that aren't getting driver's licenses, that don't want to drive, that would do anything they could to have mass transportation. We've got a coaster and a sprinter. Let's put 2 sets of tracks. Let's have consistent service.
They also differ on cannabis dispensaries. Gomez wants them in the county. Desmond does not.
I wish the federal government would go ahead and acknowledge the medical potential, I guess, of marijuana, and then you get a real doctor prescribe it to you.
Whoever wins next month will take a seat held by Bill Horn for 24 years. Priya Sridhar, KPBS News.
In tonight's Follow the Money series from iNewsSource, reporters Jill Castellano and Brad Racino explain San Diego's quest for transparency in business dealings.
You're usually here interviewing me.
Yeah, this is really uncomfortable.
It's because today we're talking about Measure J, which you've been reporting on since
August 2016.
So let's start there. Tell us all about what this is and why you're so obsessed.
I'm not obsessed. I'm just a big fan of transparency. So this measure is very simple. It's all about the city of San Diego knowing who they're doing business with. It requires companies doing transactions with the city to disclose all of the people who stand to benefit from the deal.
And there's a lot of history behind this measure, right? Something about a mobster?
Yeah, it's a great story, at least I think so. So in 1990, there was a San Diego Housing Commission meeting. The city wanted to buy 2 housing complexes for about $47 million to use for affordable housing. But one councilman, Bruce Henderson, wanted a bit more information about the purchase. Here he is 26 years later talking about that day.
I need to know, for my own sake, what financial interests are in front of us. I mean, who are we going to be buying this from? Who's going to get this money? And the staff's response was quite literally, it's none of your business, Mr. Henderson.
Who was it?
Who was what?
Who was going to get the $47 million?
Oh, that. So get this. Henderson investigated and eventually found out that the person selling the properties was an alleged mobster named Al Malnick. Henderson made a big stink about it, and eventually the mayor agreed and sided with him and said San Diego officials should always know who they're doing business with. That led to a public vote to amend the city charter with Section 225. More than 86% of voters approved it in 1992.
That sounds very similar to what we're talking about today, Measure J.
Yeah, because it's the same thing. We did a story about this in 2016 and found that the city of San Diego never actually enforced Section 225. So that's despite all the people that voted for it and 3 different city attorneys who told the city to pay attention to it. It's nuts. Down is up, left is right.
And city officials told you the reason it was never enforced was because it was too vague?
Yeah, and the whole deal with this new measure, with Measure J, is that it makes the language of that 1992 law crystal clear so there can't be any more excuses. That's basically all it does.
So now let's talk about the money behind this measure. Who's funding Measure J?
No one, not a soul.
What?
Surprise!
What?
This episode has nothing to do with funding because there actually isn't any. I just wanted to remind San Diegans how much of their money is at stake behind Measure J.
This feels like we're cheating.
We're not. Get this. So I asked for the disclosures behind more than $500 million in city transactions. So these are things like real estate purchases, sales, leases, and more than $500 million in city contracts. Now get this. Not one sale, purchase, lease, contract had all the disclosures that were required. Not one.
So the city spends billions each year in taxpayer money on these private companies.
Yep.
And there's a law that's supposed to disclose who's behind these companies.
Yep.
And nearly everyone voted for that law a long time ago.
But it's not being enforced, and Measure J will fix that.
You've also mentioned in your stories something about Delaware LLCs. Can you talk about that?
Delaware LLCs are the most impenetrable corporate structures in America when it comes to knowing who's behind them. And if this proposition passes, those corporations will be required to disclose who's behind them. And as far as I can tell, San Diego will be the only U.S. city to mandate this kind of disclosure.
Very cool.
Very cool.
Brad Rossino, thank you.
Joe Castellano, thank you.
To catch up on all 5 episodes in this series, go to inewssource.org. iNewsSource is an independently funded nonprofit partner of KPBS. We've seen political campaigns go after anything that could give them an edge. Republican gubernatorial candidate John Cox and his allies blasted Democratic challengers for cheating on their wives while in office. KQED has learned Cox has also faced accusations of marital infidelity. I checked in with KQED host John Sepulvedo about his report. John, how did the topics of marriage and infidelity make it into this year's gubernatorial race?
Well, the first time we heard about it in any widespread manner was back in February when the GOP had a debate at the San Francisco Chronicle, and that was when all the candidates, Travis Allen, John Cox, and others, attacked Gavin Newsom and Antonio Villaraigosa, the former Los Angeles mayor, for their infidelities. On the clock, they said. It showed an abuse of power, they said, and John Cox was one of the candidates who really hit hard at Gavin Newsom. Then, as John Cox was really struggling right up into the primary, we saw this attack ad come out that really hit Gavin Newsom and Antonio Villaraigosa hard, and it said, "Vote for John Cox." And it's actually an Encinitas-based independent expenditure campaign that was the one who paid for that. And they said that John Cox had the values to represent California. And of course, these documents suggest that John Cox had his own marital problems.
And so how does Republican candidate John Cox compare to Newsom on this topic of infidelity?
Well, anytime that we're comparing candidates' infidelity, we're in some trouble for voters and for the candidates themselves. But the biggest difference is that Cox had an affair while he was a private citizen. Newsom had an affair while he was mayor of San Francisco. Cox has alleged that Gavin Newsom's affair opened him up to blackmail and extortion. But John Cox's own affair seems to be rather embarrassing and the kind of thing that would prompt a blackmail or extortion attempt if John Cox's own words were to be believed. So there's a lot going on with regards to the various infidelities that they've had. But what is clear is, and these aren't my words, these are the words of Caroline Heldman, a political scientist at Occidental, it's very hypocritical of John Cox to be throwing this stone while living in this particular house.
And there's another twist with that alleged affair for Cox, right?
Yeah, so John Cox actually at one point, according to these divorce documents and according to his wife's attorney, he asked his then first wife, Nancy Cox, to essentially have a sham marriage and to have a marriage that publicly facing was happy and good, and privately he was having an affair with another woman who lived in Massachusetts. It should be noted that around this time was when John Cox first started looking at running for office, and as we know, he ran for office in 2004 for the Illinois Senate seat that ultimately Barack Obama won, and again in 2008 he ran for president, again a seat Barack Obama won.
So will any of this make a difference to voters next month when they head to the ballots?
You know, on the affair, probably not. Only 28% of Americans polled, according to Pew, actually care about whether an affair happens. And as Caroline Heldman was telling me, you know, it's really seen through a partisan lens. So if it's your guy who's committing the affair, then you tend to be, oh, well, I'll let it go. And if it's the opponent, then you tend to be, oh, look, they can't be trusted. But what this really does show is that on a strategy level, this just wasn't a smart strategy. You know, again, he is somebody who has this in his history, and it's in very open public forum, and yet he still used it as a line of attack, and something that ended up being brought out, you know, 4 weeks before the election.
John Sepulveda with KQED, thank you.
Thank you.
You can find more election coverage on kpbs.org/election, including candidate interviews and our KPBS Voters Guide. The November weather outlook issued today by the Federal Climate Prediction Center shows continued overall warm and dry conditions in San Diego County. There's also a fire weather warning for the East County. Daji Azwad has more in tonight's forecast.
Good evening. We are looking at breezy conditions to continue at least through this weekend. As far as our precipitation goes, we're looking at the satellite radar. Not much happening here for Southern California. Most of that moisture back in towards New Mexico and even further east in that in towards Texas as well as the Southern Plains. But here at home tonight, we'll notice a few clouds, but mainly clear conditions across the region. For Borrego Springs, cooling down to 60 degrees, 45 in Mount Laguna, and 49 in Oceanside. Here in San Diego, cooling down to 61. Once again, you're going to notice it's clear, but some clouds coming through in and out for tonight. Now, as we progress into your Friday, super happy that it's almost the weekend, right? Well, we're going to keep up with the sunshine and that offshore flow. This is all due to high pressure. This high pressure system moves in a clockwise fashion, and the overall circulation allows for a warm and breezy pattern to set up here across San Diego, known as the Santa Ana winds. And that is going to continue for tomorrow and at least once again into your Saturday. So seasonable out towards the east, but here at home a tad bit warm and once again very windy. We do have red flag warnings in place here across the region. Ramona, Mount Laguna, Borrego Springs included in that. Mostly once again in the mountains and valleys as well as the foothills, likely to see a danger for fire risk and as well as very breezy conditions to continue. Tomorrow's forecast, we are in the 80s. 89 in Borrego Springs, 85 in Oceanside, and 84 in San Diego. As for Mount Laguna, 64, and looking at plenty of sun. Now, as we head into the weekend, that high pressure kind of wanes off. We will notice in the upper atmosphere, upper level system beginning to develop here, but overall on the dry side out towards the west, most of that moisture and towards the south and east of the U.S. As we continue through this forecast, Sunday, Monday, that's when we notice temperatures cooling down out the coastline. This is due to that upper level system that we'll see bringing cooler air and even the return of morning and late night fog and low clouds. Mountains will remain in the 60s for much of your extended forecast. As for the deserts, we'll be cooling out of the 90s into the 80s for your Sunday and Monday. Reporting for KPBS News, I'm your AccuWeather meteorologist, Daji Azwad. Back to you, Susan.
The San Ysidro School District paid hundreds of thousands of dollars 2 years ago for an after-school program, but it never got off the ground. iNewsSource reporter Megan Wood says the district is now trying to get the money back.
$276,000. That's what the San Ysidro School District paid a San Diego woman for an after-school program that never happened. To promote her Greater San Diego After-School All-Stars, Tyree Dillingham used Facebook videos to tout her connection to former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger.
I worked for Arnold Schwarzenegger for 15 years and got to travel the world.
The district hired Dillingham in 2016 to provide a sports program for 1,600 students. The contract was canceled 3 months later when nothing was provided. The district still hasn't gotten its money back. Board member Marcos Diaz says he feels taken advantage of and partly blames past district administrators for not properly briefing the board.
You have well-meaning, well-intentioned individuals that really want to take care of their community, that really want to take care of their schools and the education for our kids, and we're at the mercy of the information being provided to us.
iNewsSource tried repeatedly to speak to Dillingham by phone, email, and in-person visits to her home.
Tyree? It's Megan Wood from iNewsSource.
She wouldn't answer. Through a spokesman, she said she recently contacted San Ysidro about repaying the district. School officials couldn't confirm that, but told iNewsSource they have again reached out to the company for reimbursement. For KPBS, I'm iNewsSource reporter Megan Wood.
San Diego Mayor Kevin Faulconer announced proposed new rules to improve dockless scooter safety. Scooter companies would be required to limit the maximum speed of scooters in certain areas of the city. They would also have to provide monthly data reports to the city. A city council committee will consider the proposed regulations next week. A pair of star-crossed lovers separated by a wall. A San Diego production inspired by the border wall headlines. KPBS arts calendar editor Nina Guerin introduces us to the dancers behind Beyond Babel.
I'm on set at Beyond Babel, a new immersive dance show in Barrio Logan. Inspired by Romeo and Juliet, it's a story told entirely through dance.
I'm Keone Madrid, co-creator and starring role.
And I'm Mari Madrid, also a co-creator and starring role.
I think people might see us as familiar because of the work that we've done, especially on TV. World of Dance, we were a division finalist on that show. And then we've done a lot of work behind the scenes, whether that be for So You Think You Can Dance, Dancing with the Stars, Kendrick Lamar, commercials, and things like that.
The Ellen Show a couple times. Beyond Babel is a show about a community of people. It's very loosely based on Romeo and Juliet, but it's really more about the community.
Behind us, we have one of the sets that we use in the show, and it's representative of a wall and a border specifically. And in our story, we have an authority figure split this community in half by putting a wall between them. And then we see how the community responds to that. But we're really inspired, obviously, being in San Diego, there's a wall nearby, and we're really just inspired by that story and all the borders that have been, not just in today's world, but also in the past. Just all the walls that have existed and how humanity has responded to those walls.
This story is told through urban dance. It's a style that really, I think, was born in Southern California over the last 20 years.
The show being born here was really a unique opportunity because obviously there being a border here, us being locals, but really just this opportunity to give a community something that's born of passion and of art. And I don't know, that San Diego doesn't get as many cool things as we would like it compared to the other cities. And we really felt like it was an opportunity to make a statement in that way.
For KPBS, I'm Nina Guerin.
Beyond Babel performances are set this weekend and they run through next month. A new season of Historic Places with Elsa Sevilla debuts tonight on KPBS. The series looks at California's history and starts with the Kumeyaay Nation. Here's a preview.
We visit with members of the Kumeyaay Nation at the Santa Isabel Reservation to learn about their rich history. They are building a pre-contact Kumeyaay village. They have already harvested different brush to cover their huts. We learn how much the Kumeyaay people rely on astrology and cosmology for their survival.
At night, we can talk about the cosmology, which is the star systems and how they relate to us, and to talk about the creation story, which the Kumiai or the Ipai creation story, to tell it in its entirety takes 4 days.
Oh, wow.
Yes, because it is an oral tradition.
What we see in the observatories and what we know from that's been passed down to us is that a long time ago that people were very cognizant of the cycles of the world around them, and the harmony and the cycles of the sun and the moon were important to many aspects of life.
You can watch more of this first episode of Historic Places with Elsa Sevilla tonight at 9 right here on KPBS. Over on Sesame Street, a swan song for the original Big Bird.
People have asked me, don't you want to retire?
Thank you, everybody.
And I can't imagine wanting to retire.
Today marks puppeteer Carol Spinney's last day on the show. He's handing over Big Bird and his other character, Oscar the Grouch, to younger performers. The 84-year-old was with Sesame Street from the beginning back in 1969. Spinney says he didn't feel like his work was important until Big Bird helped him find his purpose. You can find tonight's stories on our website, kpbs.org/evening edition. Thank you for joining us. Have a great evening.